everything you need to know about products and services that can improve your life. This is Experts on Call on CL 650.
And welcome back, and I have Dan O'Hearn from Quay Pacific Management in the studio with us, and we're talking about the relationship between the Strata Management Company and the Strata Manager and the Strata Council and the Strata Corporation. We were talking about the necessity of the communication level and how important it is that a high level of communications exists between the manager and the Strata Council, especially in light of the council changing over every year. But part of that is an education about the roles of what the services the managers provide then as well, isn't it?
Sure. I thought you were going to keep talking.
I could keep talking forever. But, you know, we look at some of the typical duties. You know, you have basic monthly accounting, all the receivables, the payables, you know.
It's beyond that. I don't think people realize the scope of work that's involved.
Right.
I mean, let's face it, most homeowners are just there, and all they expect to see is a clean lobby.
Right.
And they don't realize what's going on behind the scenes to make that happen, right? We really do in three categories: an asset management, financial management, and governance. And the reality is our day-to-day is really flipped backwards. We spend most of our time on governance, a lot of time, of course, on accounting, and very little on asset management.
And that's one of the problems that we have in our industry collectively across the province, is that strata corporations focus probably most of their energy on governance,
yes,
and basic administrative operations, but their asset, which is 100% of their investment, gets the least amount of attention, both from a time space but also from an economic space.
That's right.
Which is one of the reasons why we've had depreciation reports mandated in the province, so strata corporations can now are now by the virtue of the legislation, are required to start planning their asset futures, to actually look at maintenance schedules. And I agree, one of the real deficits that we still have in our industry, and we see this with aging buildings especially now that are playing major catch-up with very large ticket prices, is that no one's been planning for the renewal of our assets. No one's been planning for even annual service and maintenance contracts. So procurement is a big issue for you as well then. You know, who's hiring the janitorial company? Who's negotiating with the landscapers? Who's ensuring that the inspections for the roofing system and the elevators and the plumbing system and the heating ventilation system and the pools, you know, who is making sure that all of those procurement contracts are being administered, they're being negotiated, you have next year's schedules together. So, you know, you're right, when you're dealing with accounting also means all of our contractors that we're dealing with as well in the same basis.
Right. That's where probably close to maybe half of your time, or certainly a quarter of your time, is going to be spent on accounting. It's going to depend, of course, on the building, and it's going to depend on the contract we have. I mentioned earlier that you know, we can do an accounting only consulting. So obviously we're spending all our time on accounting. Their full service, it's going to be parsed back, and it also depends on the council, how involved they are in all of those procurement and making and dealing with the contractors on site. So I mean, generally that would be our role, right? And you know, we're glad to take that on. We are a resource for people, and a lot of times the councils want to just run with things. They want us to be more of almost an administrative assistant. They want to make all the decisions, and they want to move ahead. And I think they really got to tap into the expertise that a property management company can bring to the table. We're not experts on everything, but we certainly know a lot. I was thinking the other day of sort of the acts and the legislation that we got to be familiar with, right? And there's like almost a dozen.
There are, yes.
The big ones, like, of course, the bylaws and rules of each corporation. Then you got SPA, then you have RISA, and you have PIPA. And then to some degree we have the Limitations Act, the Human Rights Code, WCB, the Residential Tenancy Act. Parliamentary rules, you have to know a little bit of you know, conduct rules and parliamentary rules, or Robert's Rules of Order. The CRT is coming up soon, so that's something else for us to know. And then every municipality has different legislation regarding waste management. I mean, and utilities. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Watering restrictions, when it can be done. So there's many things we have to know. We're not experts in everything, but we certainly know where the resources are that we need to go to find the experts. And CHOA certainly being an expert in some governance, right? So we'll speak to you a lot of times about particular issues that we might have, and certainly encourage every strata corporation to be members of CHOA.
Well, the relationship with the strata manager is interesting because one of the expectations of owners is that well, why aren't you enforcing our bylaws? That's and in all of this stream of work and everything that's done, one of the things that consumes so much time in the relationship, especially in some communities, is going to be issues around bylaw enforcement. Here we have this chronic issue of a person who is having late parties night after night. And in most of the management companies, if not all, provide an on-call service, an emergency after-hours service.
Yes.
And what ends up happening is you become the recipients of those 1 a.m. phone calls from owners who have a crisis in the building.
Right.
All right. And so how do you help the community process through those disputes in such a way that the integrity of that community is protected?
Well, we're always, first of all, going to go back to the bylaws of that strata corporation, right? So you have to make sure that there is compliance or non-compliance. Then you have to inform the tenant and the owners of this violation. They have to be aware of an appeal process or for them to have a hearing on this. And then the council has to make a decision on whether a fine is going to be levied and those amounts based on their bylaws. In the old days, I think people just threw fines on there when we found out that you're parking in the wrong spot and there was a $50 fine. It was done, and certainly legislation doesn't allow for this sort of thing right now. I'm not saying that person won't be fined, but the process has to be followed.
So what you're describing, though, is the basis of a low-level judiciary system. The Strata Council are the judge and the jury of the bylaws of the Strata Corporation, and their responsibility is to administer it. But to administer it in a fair process, someone has to take care, though, of all of those communications. Someone has to set up the meetings. Someone has to set up the hearings, right? And that role is frequently, the expectation is that role is frequently placed on the Strata Manager.
We've certainly heard strata corporations referred to as the fourth level of government.
Yes.
Right? And that's where we come into, again, it gets back into mediating, moderating, creating like an arbitration process almost, trying to go through the series of events that happened there, and then also again being knowledgeable about the affected legislation and bylaws that are applicable. So this is where we spend a lot of our time.
This is Key Pacific's Talk About Strata. If you have any questions or emails that you'd like answered, we have a team that are quite happy to help you out. And the email address is questions@talkaboutstrata.com. Questions@talkaboutstrata.com. So Dan, let's talk about an actual incident of a bylaw. So I live in Unit 105.
You do?
I do. And upstairs in 205, there's quite a lot of noise, frequent chronic problem that occurs. So my expectation is I call the manager and I say, all right, this has to end. I'm filing a complaint. What are you going to do about it? So where does the manager take it from there?
Yeah, well, that's not an uncommon question. A lot of people live in wood frame buildings these days, and you get a lot of noise, everything from footsteps to vacuum cleaners to someone practicing piano. So it's a very common situation, and the typical process is going to be the complainee is going to write well, we would certainly tell them we're not going to act on anything unless it's in writing. I mean, it has to start there, right? And this complaint is going to be brought forward as a potential bylaw infraction, and the council is going to discuss the line of action. It may be an effort to, as the management company works with council, to just simply help resolve the problem. Often we will go into a unit, and somebody will go to the upstairs unit, someone will go to the downstairs unit, and we'll try to recreate the sound, because the noise may be reasonable, it may be a reasonable level, and unfortunately the person that's hearing it is very hypersensitive to it. If it's a situation where somebody is practicing piano or keyboard, and we've had that. The solution was the person would use headphones, and they're just being neighborly, right? So that sometimes is the process, and we get involved in that often. And that's ideally how we would solve a problem. This is part of this community aspect, right? Dealing with your neighbor, solving it.
Comes back to the social work side of doing the job.
Exactly, yeah, very much so. Failing that, then it may escalate. It would be a formal complaint. There would be a hearing process, and maybe fines would be levied. And the fines can be reoccurring. I mean, these things can go on. But the corporation has a duty to put an end to this, right? You have to enforce your bylaws, and simply throwing on fines is not the solution. At some point, there has to be a further action, which might be litigation or court.
I was going to say, and in extreme cases, we see that we actually will have a court order ordering that the party cease and desist from the activities, whether it's outdoor parties, whether it's having pets in buildings where pets aren't permitted. It's a variety of circumstances.
Yeah.
So they're very costly. But ideally for strata communities, fining is not a solution. It's just a punishment for the infraction that was alleged to have occurred. So that's one of the issues that stratas deal with, and of course everybody still has to live together after this dispute is resolved. So in a lot of ways, managers work like mediators as well. Right, they're arm's length from the Strata Council, they're arm's length from the owners, and they don't have a personal interest or a personal relationship with the outcomes.
And the council has to rely on that. I mean, we have to go to council sometimes and tell them the council is being unreasonable, right? Or we have to go to the homeowner and let them know that they're being unreasonable, because that may be their home. It's the only place they live. They have no other perspective. But we've seen these situations and these problems hundreds of times, right?
Yes.
And they really have to defer to expert advice at some point. I'm not saying put up with a continual bylaw infraction, but listen to a bit of degree of reasonableness. And some councils are reticent to do that.
And this is, of course, assuming that we're dealing with reasonable people in these relationships and these conflicts.
Yeah.
I know my solution when the noise gets to be intolerable is I just get my bagpipes out. And that helps to get the relationship just boiling. So, and I'm not a good piper, so that's a whole other issue entirely. But ultimately, we end up with these issues. But that goes back to the whole administration side of the strata. So we've had an infraction. It got resolved. That was great. But if it didn't get resolved and it goes to another level, and we're dealing with now fines, we're dealing with an ongoing problem. We're dealing really with two parts. We're dealing with the enforcement of the bylaw, but we're also dealing with the other side of it is, well, what are we going to do about those fines? Can we collect those fines? How are we going to proceed? Or, at some point, are we looking at court actions? And certainly we'll see some significant transformation when the Civil Resolution Tribunal comes in, because it'll give strata councils and owners a quicker venue to resolve a number of these disputes. But in the meantime, looking at the relationship with the strata manager, if my strata manager has even just 3 ongoing bylaw issues that the strata is dealing with, that has to consume quite a lot of time out of the day-to-day operations for the manager.
Yeah, we have one that's escalated into court, and I'm sure we'll all be reading about it soon enough. And this individual has taken the Strata Corporation to court 21 times.
Right.
That is unreasonable, and you can imagine it absorbs a lot of time and effort. But you can't necessarily just fine and expect to collect the fines.
Yes.
You're going to have to have a court order for that. You can't lien for those fines, right? You can only, unless you have an order. So, and then now with the Limitations Act getting ever so shorter, I think the councils really have to start speeding up some of these processes too.
Well, and one of the difficult, even if you get a judgment for fines, one of the difficulties is it just simply becomes a judgment registered on the title of the unit. But it's way down on the list. It's after mortgages, it's after strata fees that are owed, and the Strata Corporation may never collect it, even in the best cases. So hopefully the owner sells their unit and at some point you can collect it. But again, it comes down to the time consuming of the operations for the strata. I'm Tony Giventu. I have Dan O'Hearn in the studio from Quay Pacific Property Management. This is 650 Sea Isle. We are on Talk About Strata.
There's still more ahead with Experts on Call on CL 650.